On the eve of his hanging, when the jailhouse lantern burned low and the desert wind slipped through the gallows like a living thing, Elias Crow sat alone on a narrow cot, hands free for the first time in years, because there was no longer any reason to bind a man who would greet the rope by sunrise, and in that heavy quiet, thicker than gun smoke, heavier than guilt, he began to speak, not to the guards who pretended not to listen, nor to God who had been silent for so long, but to the night itself, as if the stars above the Wild West still remembered the boy he once was before his name became a warning whispered in saloons and a curse carved into wanted posters. His voice was low, worn smooth by regret, and each word carried the weight of miles ridden, lives lost, and choices made too young and too angry, and he confessed first to the things everyone believed, that he had robbed banks, derailed trains, stood unflinching in the face of gunfire, but then he drifted into truths no one had ever known, truths that bled quietly beneath the legend, like how he had never fired the first shot, not once, how fear had chased him faster than any lawman, how the blood that stained his reputation came not from hunger for violence but from a single night years ago when the world broke open and never fit right again, a night that began with a woman named Clara Whitfield, whose laugh sounded like water over stones and whose eyes held the kind of softness that could undo a man raised on hardness, a woman he had loved in silence because love, to an outlaw even then, felt like something fragile and easily stolen. Elias told how he had met her on the edge of a small town that no longer appeared on maps, how she had been tending a wounded horse with hands steadier than his own, how she had looked at him without fear even when she recognized his name, and how that look, full of quiet understanding, had marked him more deeply than any bullet, because it made him imagine a life beyond running, beyond smoke and dust, beyond the need to be cruel just to survive. And as the wind outside groaned against the wooden beams of the gallows, Elias admitted that every crime he was known for had followed that love, not preceded it, because the night Clara was taken, caught between a badge that hid corruption and a gang that mistook mercy for weakness, he had arrived too late, finding only shattered glass, a burned homestead, and silence where her voice should have been, and something inside him had turned cold and sharp, shaping him into the outlaw the West would later fear, not because he wanted revenge, but because he believed the world only understood men who spoke in force. His confession spilled on, slow and relentless, as he spoke of how he chased rumors across territories, how each robbery funded another mile closer to answers, how he spared clerks who trembled and warned young men to leave before guns were drawn, acts no ballad ever sang about, and he confessed that the most painful truth was not the lives he had taken in moments of chaos and self-defense, but the lives he had refused to build, the towns he never stayed in, the mornings he never woke to beside someone who cared, all because he was chasing a truth the West had buried. He told the empty cell that Clara had not died that night, not as the stories said, but had been hidden away, silenced to protect powerful men, and that every bloody mile he rode was meant to buy her freedom, not his own, and the outlaw legend, fueled by fear, exaggerated by newspapers, sharpened by time, had grown so large that it swallowed the reason it began, leaving only a monster where a grieving man stood. Elias paused often, breath hitching, eyes closing as memories pressed close, and when he spoke again it was softer, admitting that he had finally found her name in a ledger months before his capture, proof that she had lived, suffered, and vanished again, and that knowledge had broken something vital inside him, because it meant his war had come too late, and now, on this final night, with the gallows creaking gently like an old tree in the wind, Elias Crow confessed not to seek forgiveness, nor mercy, but to leave behind a truth the rope could not silence, that the Wild West had not been shaped only by greed and violence, but by love crushed under the weight of power, by men turned cruel because gentleness had nowhere safe to land, and as the lantern flickered and footsteps echoed faintly beyond the door, he finished his confession with a whisper meant for Clara alone, promising that even if his body swung come morning, the truth would remain, hanging heavier than any news, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. They first saw her at noon, when the sun stood high and merciless over Red Mesa and the heat pressed down on the town like a held breath, and she arrived without dust or drama, riding a calm gray horse, dressed in black that had softened with time rather than faded, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, her posture straight but weary, as if she carried memories heavier than any saddlebag. And the moment she dismounted near the dry well, the murmurs began, low and uneasy, because everyone in Red Mesa knew the stories of Margaret Hale, the widow whose name men spoke carefully, not out of cruelty but fear, a fear shaped by coincidence and tragedy, for they said every outlaw who had loved her had died violently, shot down in ambushes, hanged by the law, or swallowed by the unforgiving West. And whether curse or chance, no man had survived her. Love, so doors closed softly as she passed, eyes followed from behind curtains, and even the wind seemed to hush as she claimed the small adobe house at the edge of town, a place already marked by loss. Margaret lived quietly, tending a modest garden that fought bravely against the desert, drawing water at dawn, walking to church alone, her grief worn like a second skin, because love, for her, had never been gentle, only brief and costly, and yet she had not hardened, had not turned bitter. Carrying instead a quiet longing that settled in her chest like an ache she had learned to live with, and so weeks passed with nothing but whispers until one evening, as the sky burned orange and red, a figure staggered from the desert toward her door, leaving a thin trail in the dust, and when he collapsed against her threshold, Margaret did not scream or hesitate. She knelt, rolling him onto his side with practiced care, seeing the blood darkening his shirt. The gunshot wound high in his shoulder, the exhaustion carved into his face, and though she recognized him, Thomas Calder, a gunslinger whose name carried its own weight, she chose compassion over fear, dragging him inside, cleaning the wound with steady hands, speaking softly as if he could hear her even in his fevered half-sleep. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness over the next days, waking to the scent of sage and water, to the sound of Margaret humming low as she worked, to the sight of her sitting nearby, mending cloth or reading by the window, and though he knew the stories, knew who she was, he found himself drawn to her calm, her sadness that did not ask for pity, her kindness that did not demand reward, and as his strength returned, so did the danger, because Red Messer noticed when a wounded man survived at the widow's door, noticed the way Thomas lingered even after he could walk, offering to fix the fence, to help in the garden, to stand watch at night when coyotes cried, and Margaret, though careful, felt something stir that frightened her more than loneliness ever had, because she recognized the early signs of attachment, the shared silence, the exchanged glances, the way the house felt warmer when he was there, and she tried to keep distance, reminding herself of the pattern that had followed her life, of the men she had loved and buried, of the blood-soaked endings that clung to her name. Yet fate, unkind and patient, wove their paths closer with each passing day. Thomas spoke little of his past, only that he had been running for a long time, not always from the law but from himself, from choices that haunted him, and Margaret listened without judgment, understanding more than she said, because grief recognizes grief, and as evenings stretched long beneath the burning western sun, they found comfort in small things, shared meals, quiet laughter, the rare sound of rain on dry earth, and love, subtle and mature, grew not in grand declarations but in pauses, in the way Thomas's voice softened when he said her name, in the way Margaret watched him leave each morning and felt relief when he returned, and Red Messer watched too, unease deepening, because towns like that learned to sense when tragedy approached, and men began to warn Thomas in hushed tones, telling him the stories again, urging him to leave before the pattern repeated. But Thomas, for the first time in years, did not want to run, believing foolishly that love could be stronger than rumor, stronger than fate, stronger than the violent past that followed him like a shadow. Margaret tried to send him away gently, telling him she could not bear another grave, that loving her carried a cost too high, and Thomas, holding her hands with careful reverence, answered that some lives were worth the risk, that he had lived long enough without meaning, and though her heart trembled, she did not pull away, because hope, once awakened, is hard to silence. The trouble came quietly, as it always did, riding into town in the form of men who recognized Thomas, men tied to old feuds and unfinished business, and though Thomas tried to shield Margaret, tried to face the danger alone, the past does not honor boundaries, and the night violence found Red Messer, gunfire cracked the stillness, and Margaret, hiding inside, listened with a dread she knew too well, praying not for safety but for mercy, for an ending that did not follow the old pattern. And when the noise finally faded, she stepped outside to find Thomas wounded again, alive but fading, and as she held him beneath the stars, his blood warm against her hands, he smiled softly, telling her he did not regret staying, that loving her had been the truest thing he had ever done, and though help came, though he survived the night, something between them changed, because Margaret understood then that the curse was not hers alone, but the West's, a land that devoured tenderness, that punished men who tried to lay their guns down, and as Thomas healed, they made a quiet choice, not to promise forever, not to tempt fate with certainty, but to love honestly for as long as the sun would allow, knowing every dawn might be their last, and in Red Messer, beneath that relentless sky, their romance burned not bright and reckless, but slow and brave, a fragile thing held carefully between two people who knew heartbreak intimately, and though the town never stopped watching, never stopped whispering, Margaret Hale, the widow of Red Messer, loved again, not because she believed tragedy would spare her, but because even in a land shaped by loss, love remained the one act of defiance that still felt worth the cost. Deadwood Crossing had not seen real law in years, not since fear had learned how to wear familiar faces and the dirt street had grown used to blood settling between its cracks. And when the stranger rode in at dusk, hunched in the saddle with his coat pulled tight against both cold and memory, no one noticed the badge at first, tarnished and half hidden beneath dust and regret, because Jonah Mercer did not ride like a hero, returning, but like a man who would have turned back if the road had allowed it. And as his horse slowed near the abandoned sheriff's office, the wind stirred the hanging sign until it creaked softly, as if warning him that Deadwood Crossing remembered everything. Jonah dismounted with stiff movements, the kind earned from old injuries and older mistakes, and when he stepped onto the porch, the badge caught the last light of the sun, drawing quiet attention from behind windows and doorways. Because everyone knew that badge, or rather, they knew the story attached to it, the story of a marshal who failed, who arrived too late once before, whose hesitation had cost a town its families, its peace, and his own wife and son, a story Jonah had carried across territories like a sentence carved into his bones. He had sworn never to wear the badge again, had buried it beneath floorboards in a rented room years earlier, but when word reached him that Deadwood Crossing was preparing for war, caught between rival gangs and a council too afraid to choose a side, something restless had stirred in him, not hope, but responsibility. That quiet, relentless voice that never fully dies, and so he had dug the badge back up, cleaned it with shaking hands, and ridden toward the one place that felt like a reckoning rather than a rescue. The town greeted him with silence heavy enough to bruise, and Jonah felt the weight of every eye as he pushed open the office door, dust swirling in the fading light, revealing empty cells, broken desks, and a past that had never truly left. And as he sat alone, the ghosts came quickly, as they always did. His wife's smile before he left on that final ride, his son's small hand gripping his coat, the gunshots echoing in his memory like unanswered prayers, and he confessed quietly to the room that he had been afraid back then, afraid of choosing wrong, afraid of making things worse, and that fear had been the deadliest mistake of all. The days that followed tested him, as Deadwood Crossing revealed its wounds openly now that someone had come willing to see them. Gangs claiming streets, merchants paying protection just to breathe, families packing wagons to flee, and Jonah walked among them slowly, listening more than speaking, earning trust not with promises but presence, standing between arguments, refusing bribes, reminding people of laws they barely remembered, and when men challenged him, he did not reach for his gun first, because he knew now that courage was not loud, it was steady, and yet violence crept closer all the same, because the West did not forgive weakness easily, and the gangs, sensing resistance, began to circle like wolves. Jonah trained those willing to stand, not turning farmers into fighters, but teaching them how to hold a line, how to protect one another, how not to become what they feared. And at night, when the town slept uneasily, he sat alone with his memories, polishing the badge, whispering apologies to the dead, promising not to run again. And when the first shots finally rang out, shattering the fragile calm, Jonah stood in the street beneath a hard sun, coat flapping, voice carrying clear and firm as he ordered civilians to cover and defenders to hold. And the fight that followed was not glorious, not clean, but it was necessary, a gritty struggle measured in inches and choices. And Jonah faced men who mirrored who he might have become had he let bitterness win, men who believed power came from fear alone. And as bullets tore wood and dust filled the air, Jonah felt fear again, sharp and immediate, but this time he did not let it decide for him, moving forward when every instinct screamed retreat, because he understood now that leadership meant accepting the cost. When the smoke cleared, Deadwood Crossing still stood, battered but breathing, and though Jonah bore new wounds, he remained upright, leaning on the rail outside the office as townsfolk emerged slowly, disbelief softening into relief, and no one cheered, because what he had given them was not spectacle, but survival. And as the sun set red behind the hills, Jonah Mercer removed the badge and set it gently on the desk inside, understanding that some roles are not meant to be kept, only answered when needed. And though the ghosts did not vanish, they grew quieter, no longer accusing but watching. And as he rode out the next morning, back straight despite the pain, Deadwood Crossing felt something it had not known in years, not safety promised forever, but the proof that one broken man, willing to face his past rather than flee it, could still change the ending. And in that knowledge, the town began, slowly and cautiously, to heal. Deep in Black Canyon, where the rock walls rose like broken cathedral pillars and sunlight barely touched the canyon floor, there was said to be a vein of gold so pure it glowed even in darkness, and Silas Boone had heard of it his entire life, first as a child listening to frightened elders speak in half voices, then as a man watching better prospectors than himself ride out with hope in their eyes and never return, and now, standing alone at the edge of the canyon with a brittle map clutched in his trembling hands, he felt less like a treasure hunter and more like a witness stepping into a story that had already claimed too many endings. Silas was not brave by nature, nor cruel, nor particularly greedy, only desperate, worn thin by years of dry claims, empty pans, and the quiet humiliation of watching others succeed while he faded into the background of frontier life. And when the map came to him, passed across a saloon table by a dying stranger who smelled of dust and fear, he told himself it was fate rather than foolishness, ignoring the way the man's eyes darted to shadows that did not move and the way his final words were not instructions, but a warning whispered with his last breath, telling Silas that the gold listened, that it learned the shape of a man's desire and used it against him. The first whispers came on the second day's ride, faint and almost kind, carried on the desert wind like familiar voices calling his name, promising rest, success, a life no longer ruled by hunger or shame. And Silas tried to reason with himself, blaming heat and exhaustion, but as the canyon walls closed in and the map's markings matched the land too perfectly to doubt, the voices grew clearer, more personal, speaking of his failures, his regrets, the woman he never married because he had nothing to offer, and they did not mock him, which frightened him more than cruelty ever could, because they spoke with understanding, as if they had walked beside him his entire life. Nights in Black Canyon were heavy and unnatural, stars sharp and distant, and Silas slept poorly, dreaming of hands reaching from the rock, of gold veins pulsing like living things, of promises written in fire across the canyon walls, and each morning he woke with the same thought pressing against his mind, that he was close, closer than anyone before him. And that thought drowned out the quiet instinct telling him to turn back, when he finally found the place marked on the map, a narrow crevice hidden behind a curtain of stone and shadow. He felt the air change, cooler and thicker, and the whispers fell silent all at once, replaced by a presence that pressed against his chest, not violent, not hurried, but patient, ancient, and aware, and as he struck the rock with trembling hands, the first flecks of gold appeared, bright and undeniable, lighting the darkness with a glow that felt wrong, too alive. And Silas laughed then, a broken, breathless sound, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face, because in that moment every failure felt redeemed, every lonely night justified, and he filled his pack until it strained at the seams, ignoring the ache in his limbs, the way the cave seemed to narrow behind him, the way the whispers returned, no longer coaxing but counting, measuring, reminding him that nothing in Black Canyon was ever taken freely. The price revealed itself slowly, as such things always do, first in small ways, his water spoiling overnight, his compass spinning uselessly, his horse bolting in terror at shadows Silas could not see, and then in heavier ones, as memories began to slip from him, faces blurring, names dissolving, moments of his life fading like footprints in wind-blown sand, and when he tried to recall why he wanted the gold so badly, the answer escaped him, replaced by a hollow certainty that he must keep moving, must protect the gold, must never let it go, because without it, there would be nothing left of him. The whispers grew harsher as he struggled through the canyon, no longer gentle guides but demanding creditors, telling him the truth at last, that the gold was not cursed by the devil, as stories claimed, but by men, by generations of desire poured into the stone until it learned to hunger in return, until it required payment not in blood alone, but in identity, memory, and time. And Silas understood then why no one ever returned, because the canyon did not kill quickly, it erased, turning men into shadows wandering its depths, guarding wealth they could no longer enjoy. And as his strength failed and his thoughts unraveled, he reached the canyon's edge just as dawn broke, light spilling across the desert in soft, indifferent beauty, and with the last clarity he would ever know, Silas Boone made a choice that surprised even the whispers, because instead of clinging to the gold, he opened his pack and let it spill into the canyon, watching the glow fade as the stones fell back into darkness, feeling something lift from his chest as the voices screamed in rage and disbelief. And though the price had already been paid in part, memories lost forever, years shaved from his life, Silas stepped away from Black Canyon lighter than he had arrived, carrying nothing but a fractured sense of self and the quiet understanding that some fortunes were meant to remain buried. He was found days later near a trading post, alive but changed, Unable to say where he had been or why his eyes reflected something older than his years, and though he lived out his days peacefully, content with little and strangely untroubled by ambition, the legend of the Devil's Gold endured, whispered around campfires and printed in faded pamphlets, warning that Black Canyon still listened, still waited, and that while the desert forgave many sins, it never forgot the sound of a human heart learning, too late, the true cost of wanting more than the world was ever meant to give.